Mr. Babu Rajeev, can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can hear me. Yeah. Has Benny come on?
See, I've come, but I can't switch on the video. It says the host has stopped it.
So so that we'll enable in half a second.
Yeah. Let's.
Yes, you're here.
Yeah.
Okay. Benny, can you hear me?
Yeah. Very clearly. Okay. No problem.
Perfect. So I think we can start now.
Yeah.
First of all, namaskaram. Welcome to Conservation Conversations. This is edition 3 of this series. It's a series of live sessions that are jointly organized by the different chapters of INTACH in Kerala. For today's session, it is my privilege to introduce my senior colleague, Mr. Babu Rajeev, who's the convener of INTACH in Cochin. I'll just very briefly introduce him. He's an IAS officer who retired at the level of Secretary to the Government of India. Mr. Babu Rajeev has served as the Director General of the Ecological Survey of India. In a very distinguished career, he has also been Chairman of the Cochin Port Trust, Managing Director of the Kochi Airport Authority, etc. Sir, it's a pleasure to have you on board and do this together. Very welcome.
Thank you.
Also warm welcome to everybody who's logged in. I think it's because of Benny's popularity, we have like an unprecedented number of people logging into Zoom. We usually have a smallish number at the beginning, but there's a lot of people logged into Zoom. So welcome to all of you. We do hope you enjoy it. We hope that we're sure that you'll draw some insights out of it and you return inspired. So please type in if you have questions, and I'm sure you will have questions. Do type it in the chat box, either on Facebook or on Zoom, and we will take those questions, as many as we can, towards the end of the session. So that's that. Now I think I don't think Benny requires much of an introduction, but in the interest of a formal introduction, I have a few words. Benny is an old friend of INTACH. I think he's been associated with INTACH much before Mr. Babu Rajeev or I. I think in the early days of INTACH in the south of India, I think he's been associated. But before that, in his early days as a student, he completed his undergraduate degree in engineering, and later, following an interest that he developed in the conservation sciences, he became a Charles Wallace Scholar, and he went through his master's in conservation at the University of York in the UK. Later, he also earned a PhD from the IIT Madras, where his thesis was on the topic of rural housing. His work in the areas of restoration and reuse of buildings show a way in the context of many of the projects that we work in as part of INTACH. He addresses many of the concerns that all of us are engaged with nowadays. This includes aspects of documenting, studying ways and means of ensuring the survival of building traditions, craft traditions, and so on. His work on projects ranging from the Dakshina Chitra Crafts Village to the remarkable Muziris Heritage Project are well known, and we'll hear more about all that from Benny himself. Thank you, sir, for agreeing to do this session with us, and very warm welcome to Conservation Conversations.
Thank you, Arun, and thank you, INTACH, Palakkad, and Kochi. I've been associated with INTACH from 1984, the year in which it was formed.
It was formed.
And there was no chapter in Kerala at that time. Right. So the initial 1 or 2 years, I have represented the chapter.
Right.
Kerala chapter, I used to take part in the chapter conveners meeting. So that was my association, and I owe a lot of things to INTACH because it brought me a lot of interest into traditional architecture and conservation. So my association that way. So that's how
we
it
just
started.
saw a set of pictures of two books which you have in one case authored and in another case co-authored. And those are sort of definitive resources that all of us look to. So thank you so much for all that you do as part of the sort of conservation expertise in INTAC. I think I'll now request Mr. Babu Rajeev to sort of set the ball rolling with questions that he has and so on.
All of us in INTAC are extremely concerned about the continuous disappearing of heritage. And we therefore believe that our topic of today, that is restore, recycle and use, is most relevant. And it is also a matter of great pleasure that we have someone like Dr. Benny Kuriakose, who is so well known in the field of sustainable architecture, especially using traditional practices as well as vernacular materials. So we will hear from him a lot. Let me start, Benny, by asking you about your experiences in conservation. Now, you are a person who is very well known and created a niche for yourself in conservation as an engineer, as a thinker, as a teacher, and in so many forms. Your work brings together values of ecological, cultural, and economic sustainability. Most of your projects feature conservation of older techniques and crafts. Could you tell us, therefore, the background which has influenced you? I would also request you to specially mention about one of the projects, that is the Dakshina Chitra Craft Village, during the course of this initial talk. Thank you. Can you start?
Okay, sir. So I will do that. My experience, which I've undergone all these years, is very different. So that might be the reason why you are calling me. I've created a niche of myself. But you see, I don't have a degree in architecture like most of the people have. And my interest was photography when I was a student in school and college. At that time, college means +2. I mean, at that time, it was part of the university. Pre-degree in Kerala, it is part of, because I grew up in Trivandrum. So my interest was in photography. My interest was to become a cinematographer. At that time, the choice was, one of the choices which was there was the Pune Film Institute after my +2. But, you know, film industry is a very tricky industry. So my father was not very happy me joining at the age of 17. So he said, why don't you take a degree and then do whatever you want to do? So I had to give in to his idea. I was very young. And he said, so I also thought there was some logic in what he says. So I decided to take a degree. And then I thought I should do architecture, because I didn't have a much clear idea about architecture. At that time, there was no entrance exam, none of those things were there. You were +2 marks, or the pre-degree marks is higher secondary marks is what you get admission into architecture. At that time, architecture was not a preferred field. I mean, the people who get more or less the lowest marks get into architecture. That was the situation at that time. It was not a very highly preferred field. So I asked one of my cousins, what is the difference between architecture and civil engineering? I mean, I did not know the difference, because as far as I know, there are civil engineers. One of my cousins, who is a professor, he also designs buildings. So I asked him, what is the difference? He said the architects look at the aesthetics of buildings and civil engineers look at the techniques of buildings. This is the difference. So I compared it with photography, because my passion is photography. I wanted to become a photographer. So, so I just discovered, I mean, you can't teach composition in photography, which angle you should take. I mean, low angle or high angle, or wide angle or telephoto. It is all depends. Nobody can teach those things. But what you can teach is the techniques of this thing, how to give the light.
Benny, your audio just sort of went to, it
Okay.
came back. Yeah, now we're back. Yeah.
So it is mostly, I mean, you can teach. I thought it is mostly the techniques which can be taught. So I just decided to get into civil engineering. I mean, because I thought you can learn about techniques, but you can't teach aesthetics, which I still think what is said is true. What I did. But when I joined for civil engineering, I found that I have to do harbor engineering, highway engineering, railway engineering, airport engineering, irrigation, water structures, which has nothing to do with buildings. There is no, of course, you can say when you design a bridge, there is an aesthetics involved, but I just decided that, I mean, so.
That's an aesthetic that we lost.
We lost, yeah.
That is colonial period, bridges were built beautifully.
True. But then I see my interest in this got down. And in the 5th semester, I became a little bit like a dropout. I said I should pursue my interest in photography. So I went to the Calcutta film also, 1982. 79, I joined the college. 1982, January. 1 year it used to happen in Delhi. 1 year it used to happen in one of the other Indian cities. That year it was in Calcutta. I never seen Calcutta. So I went alone to see the movies, various films, because I used to see, it won't be wrong if I see 30 movies in a month. I used to see the morning show, matinee, first show and second show. I've seen 4 movies, even 5 movies in one day. That was my kind of interest in the movies at that time. So many of the filmmakers, many of the people who are quite famous now were my friends at that time in college. They continued with the filmmaking field. I lost interest in the filmmaking field. That is what happened. So what happened at the end of the 5th semester was that there was a paper called Architecture and Town Planning. My attendance was very low. I did not submit the assignments in time. So I got 10 marks out of 50 for architecture and town planning, which means that you have to get 65 marks to pass the exam, which I thought is such a descriptive paper, it is very difficult. So in the 6th semester, I did not wait for the internal assessment comes 1 week before the exam starts. So can't do much about it. And I did not want to repeat the semester. So in the 6th semester, I spend most of my 80% of my time reading books on architecture, because in architecture and town planning, which civil engineers take, there is not a particular paper or book which you read. In the town planning, people used to do Rangwala, town planning by Rangwala. Apart from that, there is no textbook. So you have to read everything. You have to learn the history, principles of conservation, everything you have to learn in that one paper. So I started reading about architecture, which brought back my interest in architecture. But what happened when the results came for the 5th semester, I passed in the first attempt itself. So I didn't. But since I got only 10 marks out of it, and it's out of the 54 papers I wrote for the exam, this is the lowest which I've got in my 54 papers. And now when I look back, I do all kinds of projects, master plans and conservation, architecture designs within India, outside India. So I just look back. I mean, it might be one of the. I mean, look back. I mean, it's a nice thing when you look back that you got very low marks in academics, but you try to be quite able to succeed in the field. And when I was doing my final year, almost near the exam, I was just visiting a place, and I just found Laurie Baker working at the site. So he was it was an accidental meeting with him. I knew
you were a student.
I was a student. I just 1 more month to go for the exam, and then after 1 more month finishing the course, just get into filmmaking. That was the interest. I already had contacts with the filmmakers. I just wanted to work as an assistant director, assistant cinematographer. That was the dream. So I just met Laurie Baker, but nothing was concrete when you pass out. So I met Laurie Baker and I just asked him, started talking. We talked for about 1 hour. He leaned against one coconut tree. I leaned against another coconut tree. So at the end of the talk, I asked him, can I come and work? come and work with you. And he said that, I don't have any objection, please come. And I was one of the lucky early people who were able to work with him. I think I was the fourth person to work with him. Gerard Kuna was the first, then there was one Thomas, and there was one Ramesh. Then after that, I'm the fourth person, lucky person to work with him. It was more, at that time, he was not very, was famous, but not very well adored by the engineering community nor the architectural community. They thought that his buildings will not last for more than 25 years. So that was the thing. So that's how I started. And while I was working with him, it was like, I just thought I'll work with him for 2 months. And then I started asking him a lot of questions. One of the qualities I had from childhood was to ask a lot of questions. So I asked him a lot of questions. How do you design this? How do you arrive at this shape? So which many of the architects or some people, when they grow up, they stop asking questions. But I was that full, this thing I started asking. And Baker was very patient to explain all those things. So it was like a Gurukula kind of thing, which I had with him. And he said he used to like Palpanapuram Palace very much. Then I will go and see Palpanapuram Palace. I used to go to Center for Development Studies, then come and ask. I used to write down the questions and ask him when he comes to the site the next day. We never had an office. It was always at the site. So Palpanapuram Palace was one of the things which he used to talk about. So I used to go there, learn about the traditional architecture, come and ask so many doubts about those things with him. And it was quite interesting to see that Dashrath Patel, who resigned from the NID, he was a professor and secretary and director, kind of one godfather of the NID, starting right at the beginning of NID, he was there. So Dashrath came and met Laurie Baker. Dashrath has made some photographed Kerala in the 1950s. So Dashrath wanted to visit those places again.
Okay.
And he said, I want to publish a book. And at that time, Dakshina Chitra was just formed. 1984 was the year of the trust which formed. Dakshina Chitra was inaugurated in 1996, but the trust was formed in 1984. So Mrs. Deborah Tyagarajan, who was the president of the Dakshina Chitra, and the trust was also the Madras Craft Foundation. So we just traveled through length and breadth of Kerala. So I was the translator. I used to find the ways. We stayed in some old houses, and I met so many of the old houses like Pumulli Mana, Deshamangalam Mana. Many of those houses are no more. We just picked up, and they wanted me to work and study about more. So I did a lot of studies, and that was just the beginning of my interest in traditional architecture.
Benny, I'm just going to step in here because normally when we do these sessions, I sort of ask questions from a place of very little knowledge, and a lot of people tend to have not very great amounts of awareness about these disciplines when we work on INTACH. So therefore, I just wanted to step in and just make the point that Dakshina Chitra, the project was initiated because even at that time, by the 80s, there was great alarm that all our, fine traditional buildings were getting lost. And as I understand it, the intent of Dakshina Chitra, or at least one of its intent, was to preserve at least one example each of the buildings of each region. Is that right? Is that the context?
That is correct. They wanted to create an open-air museum from various parts of South India. So for example, we have transplanted a Syrian Christian house from Kottayam, a Hindu Nair house from Trivandrum. We have another Menon house from Calicut. Now we are just doing a Muslim house from Calicut. So all these things, still buildings are being added. So we have Chettiar.
Even in the 80s, there was great alarm that these things are all getting lost. That the fine buildings, we will have a future where we won't have examples of them.
See, one interesting thing is that many of the Indians, we don't realize it. It was Mrs. Deborah Tyagarajan who studied in US. She came to India because she married a Chettiar, Dr. Tyagarajan. So her name is Deborah Tyagarajan now. And she is the one who initiated this whole process when we were not thinking about heritage or culture or this thing. So that was a great step, and she had to find the funds, find the place. She was one of the, great names who has been able to make it in that. And I got a great opportunity to work with her from 1984 onwards. And I was instrumental in doing most of the public buildings there, except one or two. And I've been part of the Kerala section. I've been able to contribute to the Tamil Nadu because it represents 4 southern states. Many of the people, architecture students and architects might have visited those places. It has become a landmark in Chennai now. So that's how I just got involved. So she came and we traveled through the length and breadth. And she wanted me to do some research on traditional architecture. So I just went and saw, because 1 week we couldn't cover the building. So I went around and looked at many of the buildings, read through the Malayalam text, which was there, met many people, many acharyas, vastu people, etc. Did interviews with them, documented those things. So it was a great learning experience for me. As part of that, I met Appukuttan Nair, who was a retired chief engineer who has designed the Kalamandalam Theatre. And he has also designed the theatre in Kalakshetra in Madras. One of the few architects from the south who had been featured in the Paris exhibition. There was an exhibition in Paris in 1986, I think, on contemporary architecture in India, architecture since we got the freedom. So he was, along with Laurie Baker, from Kerala, only the works of 2 architects were chosen. One was Laurie Baker, the other was Appukuttan Nair. So he has a place, but nobody knows him because he never went after publicity. He's a very, not very well known. So this is the Kootambalam, which he has designed. What you are seeing is the image of the Kootambalam, which you are seeing. So I was very lucky to learn from him. He taught me so many things. He was very reluctant in the beginning, but later on he started teaching me quite a bit because he thought that you are the only person coming to me for not doing a thesis or a dissertation or anything. You are coming purely to gain knowledge. So, and he had a tremendous knowledge because he designed this theatre, what you see, the Kootambalam in 1975, going through the traditional concepts and all those things. So that helped me tremendously in trying to look at it. I'm trying to learn from him. So there was this lot of learning which was there. And in between, I left Baker. I worked with him only for 9 months because he never asked me to do anything. I did not know ABCD of drafting or architecture or anything when I left him. Only thing I've learned is the Gurukula learning, which I had by asking questions and he answering me. But when I came out of his office in February, and after 9 months, there were nobody doing Baker style buildings. Baker was becoming popular, cost effectiveness, buildings in a traditional style, etc., was becoming popular. So many people asked me because they couldn't approach Laurie Baker. He was a one-man thing, but he did a lot of projects. Comparing with the size one man, he could do so many buildings. So many people asked me who couldn't approach me, can you design a house for me or can you do this building? That's how I started designing buildings. When I left Baker, I thought that I will not be able to design even a 250 square feet house. But people asked me, I did it. And some of my earlier projects I've done. And then Cosford asked, Cosford was formed. Cosford was not formed to do housing projects, although they are famous for housing projects, cost-effective techniques. At that time, they had no intention, but I joined Cosford.
Right.
Because the Vaisham. This was the picture. What you see is my first building I've designed. It is on the riverside in Kottayam. This was a photograph to one of the Professor P.C. John and Susan John, who used to work in CMS College. I did their house. This was my first project. After that, projects were coming because there was no habitat technology. Cosford was just started. There was no building center, Nirmiti Kendra. Everything came more or less at the same time, one after the other. So I was working with Cosford. So I did the initial 3 buildings. We organized a training program in a paddy field, and where I mean, some of the participants who are quite famous. One is Shankar of Habitat Technology. He was 3 years senior to me in college, but he has not done the Baker style building. So he was one of the participants in this. Jay Gopal, who was a 3rd year student or 4th year student at that time, he and 3 of his classmates. So I called many of my, Shankar was a friend of mine for a long time, Shankar. So many of the people were my friends, the rest of the people from Thrissur. So many of them have started doing similar buildings. That was one of the reasons for the birth of the spread of the Laurie Baker technology. So we did 3 model buildings there. One was built with mud, one was built with stone, and one was built with brick. So that was done. And then another interesting thing which happened at that time was the demolition of the Deshamangalam Mana.
Benny, before you go into that, and I'm very interested to hear that, because you had the privilege of, I mean, it's a very somber privilege, because Deshamangalam Mana vanished soon after you saw it, and we never could see it. But before you go, could you probably, I mean, with Baker's work, one of the things that we often hear is that beyond the values, the sort of limits of Baker's work was that it was turned into a style, that it was seen as a superficial style, and whereas Baker himself sort of embodied certain values of frugality. So do you have a description, or what is your take on the essence of Baker's work?
See, at a personal level, I think Baker never wanted a style of his own. I mean, this is the feeling, I mean, my experience. So he has built so many houses with stone. In Himalayas, whatever projects he has done, he never used burnt bricks. He used only stone there. Even for roofing in Himalayas, he used stone. I mean, while I was working with him, he did a mud house, quite a large school school made out of mud in Tirunelveli district. And he has done stone houses in hilly areas. So that is that. But the thing is that many people will, I mean, he was a great man, and he influenced a whole lot of younger generations more than anybody else, any other architect in the country. There are people who follow Baker's principles, or in part or full. So I decided that, I mean, we have to understand his principles and decide to deviate from what he is doing. So I took a decision in 1992, 1990, 91, 92, I decided to, till then I have done only Baker style buildings. 92, I decided to break away from it. Then that is when I did Mammootty's house, which was a breaking point, I mean, landmark project for me, which I did not follow fully the Baker style, but exposed brickwork, tiles, clay tiles for the flooring, arches for lintels, lime plaster was used in the house, exposed brickwork was there. We used stone as a natural material in that building, but I still did not strictly follow Laurie Baker style. So that was a major through, because yeah, tell me, sir.
No, if you put in simply speaking, I mean, I have also heard about Laurie Baker style for a long time, seen so many buildings. I thought Baker style simply means low cost, local materials. Is it correct if I put it simply this much?
So Baker's principle was much broader. What he wanted was that avoid waste in construction. So instead of calling it low cost, it will be better to call it no waste houses. His buildings were very simple. He never gave importance to the front elevation. Many of the architects now give tremendous importance to front elevation. You go to the side, the building looks very ugly, because it is like applying, putting makeup and lipstick and all kinds of face pack or anything on the building. But Baker never believed in any of these things. That was his greatness or kind. And he used timber also. He used all kinds of material. The Tiruvalla church he did was in timber. He has done another church which I have seen, Aragiya Pandyapuram in Tamil Nadu. That church was built in timber. So there are many projects but in the 70s and 80s, there was an argument against timber. that we should limit the use of timber. So after that only he reduced the use of timber. Otherwise, many of his early projects, he has used timber in a much bigger manner. So he tried to change it according to the situation, materials available. So I think that is his great thing. He did not advocate for a style or any of those things. And we used to have a lot of arguments when I used to work with him, because when I worked with him, he was 67. I was the fourth person to work with him, and 67-year-old man. And I asked him that if you don't transfer what you know to the next generation, your relevance will go with the death of Laurie. But so he said, no, I never want to do it. I'm not bothered about publicity. I enjoy what I'm doing. I'm doing what I think is correct and believe, which is the typical Gandhian way of looking at it. But if he has not transferred to the younger generation, through to Cosford, to me and Jay Gopal and many others, I mean, relevance of Baker, we would not be talking. This is what happened to Appukuttan Nair. He was a man of great knowledge about traditional architecture, timber joinery. I mean, he knew Sanskrit, but never transferred it to the younger generation. I mean,
it's very interesting because a gentleman who's attending the session, his name is Vinod. So he says almost exactly the same thing about your work. So he says these things need to be sort of documented and turned part of pedagogy so that youngsters are aware of the values of the work that people like yourself do, and then it becomes part of the wider stream of practices. So that's a little comment that Vinod has written. I'm just I have the very unpleasant task in these sessions of stepping in when people are saying very interesting things. But you wanted to. I'm very interested to hear that little incident where you were at the sort of, and you were able to see the Deshamangalam Mana, one of the last Padanaragattas. Just before it vanished.
No, there were other Padanaragattas as well. Pumulli Mana also was a Padanaragatta, which was demolished much later. But Deshamangalam Mana, the thing was that it is not very old at that time. I mean, talking about 1985. When this November 3, you can see the date. So this building was not as old as many other houses, but it was one of the biggest houses because the family was very rich when this was constructed. And the house was locked. Nobody used to live. Everybody used to live in Thrissur or Calicut or Vadakanjeri, etc. And there was, at that time, there was a lot of people who had it was a joint family which owned the property. So they thought that they cannot divide the house. Some 55 members were, I think, including the youngsters. So they wanted to sell it for an auction. And I could see all these timber merchants coming and putting a value to the timber columns and to the timber beams, and there will be termites here. This will bring me that much amount of money, discussing against each other. And I was there as a spectator taking photographs of the building, because that was the day when you were allowed entry into that building. It was kept locked normally. I'd seen this building before, but I couldn't go inside because it was kept locked. But that day I could go inside and take photographs of the inside. And most of the photographs which came in, for example, in Kalagumadi gave an article, Illustrated Weekly gave an article. It was my photographs which came in the magazine. And this was very helpful for me also, in the sense that a demolition of a building is becoming a news. Even now, many of these historic buildings which are demolished doesn't become a news at all. One fine day, you find an important palace or a palatial building or building being demolished. Nobody talks about it. But at that time, and I was very instrumental. And when I went for my Charles Wallis Trust interview, I mean, as I said, I don't have any experience or degree in architecture. So the interview board asked me, the first question they asked me, do you know about a building which was demolished in Kerala? Because it has covered in the national newspaper. So the question, my answer was that I was the one who brought it into the national press. I was instrumental in bringing it. So then the interview went my way. So 39 architects applied, one civil engineer applied. The civil engineer was one of the persons selected for this thing, which gave me a master's degree education in one of the top universities at that time. So it gave me tremendous exposure in terms of the thing. I could meet architects from so many countries. And it was the flexibility in UK where they allowed civil engineers also to take a master's in conservation studies. So that gave, so it was very good. So all these, it was a series of events which made my career. And now also that's exactly what is happening.
So the one of our friends who I suspect would also be your friend, Malini Krishnangutti.
Yeah.
So Malini has a very nice observation. She says that Baker's work is also one of the great spatial delights which rarely gets talked about. In fact, she says that it's Gaudi-esque. She feels the aesthetics are similar to the Spanish, the Catalan architect, the great master Gaudi. An interesting point. She says it's quirky and humorous. But from your description, and I think more relevant from today's session, what I think I took away was the fact that Baker sort of also sort of embodied values of not taking from nature more than what you absolutely need. A certain responsible approach to drawing from nature. Now, our session today, we are talking about your work in restoration, recycling, and reuse. For many of us, these are words we sometimes use interchangeably. Now, you have worked but for a professional like yourself, these are very distinct stances in your practice. So, for the benefit of people like us, could you tell us what these three things are? Perhaps with examples: restoration, recycling, and reuse.
I'll just try to explain. It's a bit difficult. First, I will tell restoration. Right. First, let me tell conservation. Conservation is a broad field in which restoration is one subset or one part of it. There could be transplantation. You can transplant an old building from one place to the other. Rehabilitation, you just convert it into adaptive reuse. So there could be so many subsets as part of it. Preservation means you normally preserve exactly the way it is, which normally is not practical to do a building, preserve a building, but it is always possible to preserve an artistic object or a sculpture because you need museum conditions, etc. So preservation, so they say preserve is done. So when it comes to buildings, people normally don't say preserve. Restoration means you bring back the building to an old state. For example, I'll just try to give one or two examples. One is the example is that we have done the conservation of Paravur synagogue. And there was a heikel or similar to the altar. They call it ark also. This was a photograph. I mean, what you see in the screen is a photograph taken in the 1950s of the Paravur synagogue, where that timber, the altar or in Jewish synagogue, they call it heikel or the ark, which might be very old. And this is a close-up view of this thing. But the photograph which I've shown earlier is what was there in the Paravur synagogue. Now that heikel is not there. The photograph you see, I mean, this is the Paravur synagogue, but it was dismantled and taken to Israel. It was India's heritage, Kerala's heritage. It is not Jewish heritage alone. Just like our Kohinoor diamond was taken out of here, Peacock throne was taken out of here, so many Chola bronzes were taken out of here. Amaravati sculptures were taken out of here. This was also taken out. Anyway, that's a big issue. So now this photograph is from the Jerusalem Museum. And when I visited the building in 2007, this photograph was taken by me, and you could see bathroom tiles in place of that. It was the Spartak tiles, which you see in place of that heikel. Because it was taken back to Israel, and there will be still Jews at that time. That is why you find all these chandeliers. Now, all these chandeliers were stolen by a thief within 1 year by the time we took possession of this building. And the person who has stolen it, the thief, he did not know the value of these chandeliers. He sold the brass. He took the brass out of it and sold. So he would have got 10,000 rupees by destroying. So it is destroying this heritage or the chandeliers, and we restored it. So we decided to make a replica of it, which is not normally. So this was a drawing. I mean, one girl, one architect in my office spent 3 months working on the drawings. And we had to interact with the craftsman, how to do it, because the depth of the carving cannot be shown in an architectural drawing. So we can't do a 3D at that time, because when we did it in 10 years ago, it was not possible. So we did this drawing, worked with the craftsman, and the craftsman started working on the carving. Now, if you go to the synagogue, which is now converted into a museum as part of the Musiris Heritage Project, you can see this thinking. Even there were Hebrew letters. We wrote it down and sent them, because one dot can change the meaning in Hebrew. It is a very tricky language, the way it is. But we were able to make a replica of it, which is based on that. Looking at the photographs and getting some overall dimension, we just tried to make this. So you can say that you restored the Haikel, because something which was not there, which was dismantled or destroyed, was restored back. Another example I can talk, one very classic case of example is the mosque, Cheraman Masjid, or the Cheraman Mosque. I mean, this is an old photograph taken of the mosque. I mean, there were
this is the first mosque in the entire subcontinent. Is that right?
At least in India. It was one of the earliest mosques, and this was the photograph of the mosque. It looks like with the typical timber roofs and all those things. And and in 1984, I took this photograph. I knew the minarets, because of the Gulf influence, Middle East influence, minarets and domes, because this is the influence of the Persian style of architecture, domes and minarets. This was never part of the traditional Kerala church architecture or mosque architecture. And this is what I could see. And then in 2010, I mean, again, some more concrete additions, and I mean, the so-called traditional, I mean, they've added a steel truss roof, etc., to make it look like a typical traditional Kerala architecture tried to do. These changes were done in 1990s. I mean, so this is what was done. So the mosque authorities approached me for a scheme of, they realized, when I first approached them as part of the Musiris projects, they were not interested. But 3 years down the line, they approached saying that they are ashamed of this mosque and they want to restore it back. And it was not a decision imposed. It was the general body took the decision, and now the work is happening. And what you see, the minarets and the concrete additions are being demolished. The historic part of the historic core is still there, what you can see in this picture. The older mosque is there, but the verandas and all those things have been demolished when they made the additions. Now we are restoring back the mosque to its original state. So, so we made a proposal. So this is the 3D visualization of the mosque being restored back to its original state. Of course, they wanted some facilities. We are working with them on the various facilities which is to be added. But what is happening is the old mosque is being, and so if the lockdown was not there, it would have been over. Because of the lockdown, the work got held up. And then the rains came, so they couldn't add the roofs and repair the roofs and all those things. Within a few months, this project will be over. And it will be a major step when we say that all the temples and churches and mosques, everywhere they're trying to add concrete and remove the ugly additions. This is a major step taken by a mosque committee, including the general body, without any political or external influence. They were able to bring this back to the thing. So what restoration means, you bring it back to a previous state. So you can bring a 2000, now you can bring it back to say 1920s or 1850s. So that is the thing. I mean, it is not widely done, but it can still be brought back to its original state. So this is what is known as restoration. Now, what is recycling? I'll just try to explain that in simple words. Recycling means you recycle the materials or recycle the building. If you recycle the entire building, it's called conservation. If you recycle a part of it, then it is called recycling materials. What happens is a process, you make changes to it. You are not bringing back to an earlier state, but what you do is to make changes to the building, and that makes a whole lot of difference to the thing. So recycling, so you might use old timber, old rafters to make doors and windows. Then you are converting timber which was used for rafters. You just convert it into making new doors and windows. So there is a recycling happening there. You see, like this, I mean, the pictures which I'm showing. But on the right-hand side, you can use a window. If you use the window exactly like that in a new building, then it becomes reuse. Right. So there is a subtle difference, the way I understand it, I'm trying to convey. I don't know whether it is clear from a layman's point of view. So you just reuse the window in a new building without making any changes. But for example, this is a building which we did conservation. It was in a very, very bad shape. And I don't have the picture of the before and after. So we conserved, this building, it's recycling the whole building. It's very sustainable, very energy saving, and a lot of materials are being saved. And that is what is being done. When you reuse means you convert part of it into something else. I'll show more examples in the coming pictures. So this is, we added a kitchen in the entire building is built with timber walls, and it's like a vacation house of the second house. They live in a city, and this is their ancestral house in the village. So where they conserve. So they don't want a, very big kitchen. So they just wanted to have some kitchen. So this kitchen was added. All these photographs were taken before they occupied. That's why they look like this. And this is
I just want to I'm just speaking from the part of the state that I'm from. I'm from, as you know, I'm from Palakkad, and it's a relatively backward part of the state.
Yeah.
And every, I don't know, couple of kilometers, you have a trader who basically deals in parts of old houses that have been demolished. And I don't often see people who are building new houses, especially people from, normal people. So the house you just showed, it's clearly somebody, it's a house owned by somebody from an elite strata of society. But generally people who are putting up their first house and so on, they generally are very reluctant to source old materials, which might have a lot more life in it still. But generally, there is some form of social reluctance to reuse material. They feel it's not cool to do that. Do you have a view on that?
Just before the answer,
tell sir.
In Cochin, particularly, I have seen in Matangeri, there are a number of shops which have collected a whole lot of old buildings, parts which were demolished. Not the whole building, but part by part. And I tell you, these are sold at very, very high prices. People, mostly I think people from the West use it, or very rich people to sort of make buildings. So while what you mentioned earlier was about sort of disinclination of the people to use the old materials, there is also the other side where the old materials are at a very high premium.
True. But it tends to be a slightly elite pursuit to reuse materials, whereas in the reality of our world, it would seem as if it should be done by almost anyone. But then something stops people from doing that more frequently. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Arun said that there are two. I'll try to, both of you have brought two perspectives. One is that culturally, some people have some of the house owners we have met have also told the same thing. One, it is, forget about the antique value. What you see in Matangeri or Karaikudi, etc., are the old columns which has an antique value. So it is priced at a very high premium. As you say, only the rich can afford it. But most of the other pieces are sold at 1/4 of the price. If you just sell rafters or say old doors and windows, which doesn't have an antique value, simple doors and windows, they are sold at 1/4 of the market value. So it is sold at such a cheap. So which I used all these materials in my buildings in a big way. Earlier, I used to go out and source many of these materials from things, and overall the building cost will come down. The cheapest way to build a new house now is not any of these low cost or cost effective techniques which many of the people say. the cheapest way to build is to use old materials and construct a new house. They are sold at scrap value. It is sold at scrap value. It is very economical to restore or, to reconstruct a building, which is also part of it. I initially, during my initial period of my career, say 1990 to 2005, 10 kind of thing, I've used, gone to this, I'm not much to Mattancherry, but I've been to Mattancherry or Karaikudi and sourced these antique columns and carvings, etc. When you try to use it in rich people's houses, what is happening now, you are allowing demolition of buildings in a different way. It is encouraging the demolition of these buildings because people sell these buildings because of the antique value. Now, what you see in this, if you can just go to 2 slides before, these columns have some antique value. These windows are sourced. Next. This one. These windows are, it doesn't have much value. We are sourced it, but we are used it in this building. This building for which I got an award, Visram on the Sea, which is in my website. All the doors, windows are recycled doors and windows, and which was purchased at 1/3 of the price. You just go to the next picture. Those 2 windows which you see, I picked it up 500 rupees a piece. 500 rupees a piece. So 1,000 rupees I paid. Of course, it is 15 years ago or 20 years ago. You can't think even that you would have spent labor cost of making those windows would have been. So the roof is entirely made with recycled, buildings from old demolished buildings. The entire stone that you see on the edge and what comes at that lower floor, all these stones were sold because nobody uses, when the buildings are demolished, the antiques are sold at a high price. The rest of the thing is used by the poor people or used as firewood or goes as scrap. Nobody uses it. So I have tried to make use of these things in a reasonably. So, for example, in this is a resort. The entire tiles is recycled because these tiles, when they make a concrete addition, these tiles are available at such a cheap price. Even when you pay for the transport, it will cost 1/10 of the price of a mangrove tile. Because its thermal comfort is much better because over one tile there are 2 tiles or much overlap of tiles. Thermally it is much comfortable, but you have to use these tiles. So initially when I used to source for this resort, when we sourced initially, they said, please take it, give us some money. After that, the demolition people or the contractors, they know that it is going for some project, they started demanding some money. So I think we bought it for some 35 paise per tile. And 10 tiles are required for 1 square foot. So 3.5 rupees is what we paid. This would have been done about 10 years ago, I think 8 years or 10 years ago. So we paid 3 rupees 50 paise. No covering is possible for at 3 rupees 50
So Benny, I've been given a tiny little chit that informs me that we are at the 1 hour point.
Okay.
So I think, because before things get...
I think we will rush through a little bit.
Go a little faster.
Yeah.
So would you like to move on to the next question?
I'll just make one point. If you use timber can be recycled. And if you use lime can be, building built with lime can be recycled. You can reuse the laterite, you can reuse the bricks. All of our traditional buildings can be recycled or reused, or components can be reused. Whereas the concrete, the modern building material, you cannot reuse or recycle. I just want to stress that point, that it becomes a waste material. If you have to demolish a concrete building, you have to pay money to them to demolish the concrete, whereas the old buildings will fetch in some money.
So there are for many questions that this opens up about to what extent do we have old material, because obviously the need for new houses is much more than the population of old buildings. But again, these sessions are meant to open up thoughts, and Benny is very open to answering questions even offline. So as much as possible, we'll open up these possibilities. We'll take some questions, but some of these other questions, I think the conversation should go on after this.
Yeah.
Please.
You mentioned about recycling, restoration, and reuse was extremely interesting. But one thing problem which I think it faces, aren't we having some shortage of sufficiently skilled labor? Because today, even to get a carpenter is a big problem, a normal carpenter. But when you go to restoration of old buildings, I think there is a certain amount of non-availability of skilled labor. Equally, there is a shortage of materials like timber or lime. So what do you think about it? I mean, because of the scarcity of materials and manpower, skilled manpower, there is a problem of restoration.
Okay, first let me come to the skilled labor. See, one advantage we have got in India is that skilled workmanship is still available. We do not have the issue of the West where many of the skill set was lost. What we need to do is to identify the craftsmen, give them continuous work. I am able to do all these buildings. It is no magic in it, nothing secret, nothing. You just identify the craftsmen who can do. And once you give work to them, pay them properly. You have to receive. One thing is that, you see, the whole society goes after quantity. You don't want to recognize a craftsman. You want to pay a craftsman at the end of the day by the number of bricks he has laid. Whereas in the olden days, that was not the tradition. We looked at how he has laid the bricks, what quality of workmanship he has done. Now we don't look at it. The society has undergone changes, but you will be able to work. So we work in a particular way that we make sure that we don't engage. I don't do construction or conservation. We get it done through contractors and labor teams. And we make sure that they get paid and they get continuous work so that these skills are not lost. There are many youngsters in carpentry work who are very highly skilled. For example, this Athambudi tiles. When I went to Athambudi 25 years ago to do a project, there were hardly less than 10 factories, 10 places where they were manufactured. Now there will be 200 or 250 places where they do the Athambudi tiles. I used in Athambudi tiles and that Visram on the Sea, which was done in 2001. It came as a cover story and I started getting emails and phone calls from all over India or even from outside asking for where can you find these tiles. Even now, one of the questions which I get in my email, where can you source Athambudi tiles? But this is where once you give work to them, they get a money, the prices have gone up, but I think let the person who produces it make the money. We should try. It's not a middleman. Athambudi tiles doesn't require any firing, very sustainable technology which can be used. Look at this timber joinery which you find. We were very highly skilled in timber joinery. We have a very high skilled labor. But all these things we have lost over the years. So my solution will be to do buildings where these techniques are used. So many of the new buildings, we try to make use of these techniques. Where the skill, for example, this is a carpenter made by a Kerala carpenter, of course, with some little bit design input, which is 21 feet with a double roof, which you see, and it has used recycled timber as well. This is a kalari which we have done in Chandralega, dancer Chandralega, as a memorial for her. This building was inaugurated at the first death anniversary of her in her compound where she worked and she had dance classes, etc. So all these things are possible. And lime, see, there is no shortage of availability of lime. Cement is made from limestone or lime shells.
Yes.
So lime is available, but then it's not a marketable. In Chennai, there are places where lime is available because lime is used for various other things also. If you want 5 tons of lime tomorrow, you can just go because they put it in the kiln only when you tell them. Because the more it's not kept in the kiln. So there is a place in Chennai called Kurukupete where you can go and buy the entire street is where they sell lime. So all the places, there are places where these things are being sold, but
use it for building construction or?
See, I use it even for my new buildings if possible. Because lime has many advantages. Many advantages. You see, the modern engineers and architects are taught about the disadvantages of lime, but in conservation, you learn about the advantages of lime. So you try to look at from a kind of like reverse quarantine. I think it is something like a reverse engineering or reverse kind of thing that you learn from the traditional know-how that these lime can be used in modern buildings as well.
Let me mention you something here. I'm just recalling. No, yeah, India has done a lot of work in Angkor Wat.
Yes.
Angkor Temple, we were the first to do that conservation work.
Yeah.
And we have so much criticism from conservationists because we have used a lot of cement.
Yes.
No, they shouldn't have used cement.
And those buildings.
I recall the French agency that lost the bid to the ASI. I recall media reports from the time. The French agency was particularly vocal because I think they were also a little peeved that the project went to the ASI and not to them. So they were the ones who I recall front-ending that complaint that cement was.
No, but they see cement use should be minimized. There are so many studies done that the cement plaster will not see. When I studied for conservation in UK, there were only 2 or 3 books in our library on concrete conservation. You now just go to Amazon and type repair of concrete or conservation of concrete. Hundreds of books you will get. So this is the state of affairs. We thought that concrete is durable, lasts permanently, but that is not true. I mean, there are a lot of research studies which have shown lime plaster is durable. Concrete is not, I mean, gets affected by so many other things. I mean, it's a, many of the requests which I get, I mean, many of the reports that we make in the office is repair of concrete buildings. Because when some of the buildings which are built 10 years ago, they say have to be pulled down. Conventional engineers go and look at it and say the building has to be pulled down. Or all they can tell is to do waterproofing properly. So, but we know how as a conservation, one advantage of getting training is, you know, how to approach even a modern building, concrete building. So we make reports. We have saved many other concrete buildings as well. Because repair of concrete is this building which I put the photograph is only 10 years old. It's an engineering college in Karur.
Right.
And it is built with, it belongs to the Chettinad Cement group also. So there was no shortage of cement while they made it, but it has many drawbacks and shortcomings because they resorted to say cheap quality of construction. So even when you have granite flooring, the photograph on the left, there are salt coming, you can see the roof. So they thought that the building has to be pulled down. So we have given a recommendation that the building need not be pulled down, how it can be salvaged. And the cost will be almost 50. I mean, you saw the bill for state, but it will cost 15% of the cost of a new construction. So there are possibilities the way you look at it, but you need higher forms of knowledge to conserve a building. This is a building where bamboo, this building is more than 100 years old. So bamboo, if it is not attacked by insects or termites and fungal attack, bamboo will also last. I mean, why do building, what is the reason why many of these things, there has to be a reason for its deterioration. If timber or bamboo, if it is not attacked by termites, in Pattanam in Muziris, we found out a boat which is 3rd century, could be almost 2000 years old, made of anjali, which is from the ficus family, one of the timber. So it is possible. So
there is a question which we'll come to about how to, it's a very sort of operational question about how to address termite attack, which is the most frequent, but we'll come to that in a minute.
Yeah.
In the interest of time, I'm just going to compress 2 things I wanted to ask. Like we said, these things of reuse and using older buildings for newer functions, all of these things in the unique country that we are done by the elite. And by definition, it's a very small number of people who do those things, those practices, who have, I don't know, a refined aesthetic sense, or their values are refined, or whatever, for whatever reasons. But we are a large country. We are a country of a huge population. And we are seeing limits to how much we can draw from the nature. Ironically, we see a reality where, you know, the first-time house builder uses a lot of industrially produced material. Like earlier in the day, they used to source local materials. But the first-time house builder who has got a small budget now uses a lot of industrially produced materials. They bring in marble, they bring in glass, and so on and so forth. And generally, there is a perception when you address it, there is a perception that using older, natural materials, these are things that they cost more, they have low longevity, and therefore, building in the concrete vocabulary, using industrially produced materials, they are cost effective, they are more durable. This is a perception that exists it's a widespread perception. How do we change that? Who has to take a lead? Where is this perception coming from? Obviously, it is not a sustainable practice. So what are your thoughts?
See, one thing is that the rural people or the poor people always try to imitate the rich. I mean,
but ironically, that's not happening in this particular example.
No, but I mean, they try to imitate the people who are doing all these fashionable buildings.
Right.
I mean, say kind of things. You can't blame them in one way, but there is a lack of knowledge on the professionals. They see now, if we ask, I mean, this is one of the questions I ask. If you ask, how many years will a concrete building last? I ask sometimes this question in many of my talks in a class when I ask the architecture students. Some people say 30 years, 50 years, maximum 75. Nobody says the concrete buildings will last for more than 75 years. So then I ask them the next question. 5 years, you learn about how to do concrete buildings. And if your buildings are going to last only for 75 years, why do you want to do that? There are our traditional buildings which have stood 200 years, 300 years. There are hundreds of thousands of mud buildings in our villages. I grew up in a mud building. I mean, my father owns a mud building in Trivandrum city. It is a 2-storied mud building, built with mud, no bricks or anything. And I've spent my childhood there. My father still owns that building. So, I mean, many of these houses I've done. House for Nandan Nilekhani, some years ago, those were built with mud. I mean, plastered with mud, built with brick, plastered with. So all these things which you find across in many of the bungalows. So there is a lack of knowledge on the part of the engineers because they learn only about concrete and steel. They don't learn about lime. They don't learn about earth as a building material. They don't learn about timber. So there is a huge knowledge thing. Our traditional craftsmen and carpenters masons went in one line, and the modern professionals went in a very different line. See, the principles of architecture to build, say, for example, in Kerala, because Palakkad, which is a tropical humid climate, sloping roof is very important. Overhang of the roof. Next picture will show the overhang of the roof. You see overhang, even if your building is built with timber and mud, no rainwater is going to fall on top of it. And sun's rays never falls on the walls because of the low roof. So inside is always cooler, although you have very little windows. That is for other reasons. They are social, cultural reasons. They had very little windows for the inside. They never used to read and write in their bedrooms. Bedrooms were used only for sleeping. But now we spend most of the time in the bedrooms. Things have undergone changes. This principle which you find, just take the next photograph. See, this building is right in front of the Palpanabaswamy temple, that Kudiramaliga, the palace complex, which the Trivandrum royal family owns. It's built with timber, built during the time of Swathi Thirunal, 1850. I think that is the year. So almost 180 years, these timber are still doing good. They have not applied any paint. They have not applied any preservative. They are given the overhang of the roof. So it will last. This knowledge of what determines the durability. I mean, this is a mud house in my village where I used to go. This is where we used to sharpen our knives. Blacksmith's house in my village, which was made out of mud and the thatched roof. I mean, you see the same principle which is used to making the Kudiramaliga Palace or Palmanavaram Palace. This huts are also made using the overhang, low roof, thermal comfort. See, this building's the roof is coming very low. So use the local materials. You can see this is using palm leaves. The palm leaf I think the next slide will show the tree also in the compound. So the way it is there, see, they try to use these materials. So you can see the tree. That tree doesn't have any use. Once in 4 years, he cuts the leaves and rethatches the roof. This way of building, with the introduction of the modern technology, has gone. Now, if you want to stay in a thatched roof, if you go to Bali, you pay $1,200 a night to stay in a building. I mean, of course, we have Lakshadweep, but with the CGS group, you want to stay in a thatched coconut resort or Mararikulam Beach, etc. You pay very much equivalent to $500 or $600. So which the villagers used to do every day in their life.
So one question, an obvious pushback that would come is, obviously thatch has its own inconveniences for, so even for wood, even for using wood, unless you find inexpensive used wood, which still has some of its life left in it, you have to buy new wood. And most people would say that buying new wood is way more expensive than casting a roof in concrete. So what is the response to that?
See, in our new projects, new buildings that we do, we use old wood.
No, in case old wood is unavailable and you're in a place where old wood is unavailable.
See, one of the things that we do, you see, in our engineering know-how, we use only teak. In Kerala, they use jack or anjali, some imported species of timber. We have worked with different species of timber.
Okay.
So when I've done projects with eucalyptus has certain issues.
Right.
So if you can overcome those issues, it is a very durable timber.
Right.
The timber is more stronger than teak, for example.
Okay.
It is dimensional stable. You can't make a door and window with eucalyptus, but you can make a beam with eucalyptus. You can make a roof with eucalyptus.
Okay.
Dimensional stability. So there are other species of timber which is available at much cheaper rates. I mean, coconut timber we are using it for, in Dakshinaditra, we transplanted one building that uses coconut timber. And that timber is at least 100 years, and we transplanted it 25 years ago. It's still standing without any problems. And many people will find mango timber is quite durable. People don't use it much, but there are people who make doors and windows in mango timber. So these kind of things, we have some set knowledge and kind of thing that we always have to use teak. We always have to use. So one of the things is that we have gone into the traditional knowledge system. Many of these things are not there in textbooks. We have gone into the traditional knowledge system and learned from that. And we try to apply that knowledge in a contemporary or context. That is one of our strong points. See, now all these, many of these things like oxide flooring, Athamudi tiles, any of these things is very easy to do, nothing complicated. As you said, that it is time that we make it. That's one of the efforts that we would like to do of spreading how it can be done, like a do-it-yourself. We have an idea to make it do-it-yourself rather than nobody has to go through the experience which I had to go through, learning from the craftsman directly.
So basically, propagating this knowledge is one of the big.
We would like to do it as much as possible. I mean, now things have changed. 20 years ago, there was nobody using this kind of buildings. But I mean, I started using this thing when I did Mammootty's house, or we have bought an old house in Mammootty's house. We have made the gate. We have done the paneling of the home theater, which he built with old timber. We have done some part of the house also with old timber, which we bought from an old house. So if Mammootty can do it 28 years ago, why can't people do it? So it's a psychological barrier. Some people has got it, and but then one advantage of the rich people or the elite, when they do it, the others will try to get that. This is what Baker has done. He has done. Professor K.N. Raj's house, who was a former Delhi University Vice Chancellor. Then the others also will get this technology is good for me also. So he said the same technology for the rich and the poor, which is very important. He did not have two standards, one for the rich and one for the poor.
That was some time frame, because I think we are quite interesting, and we can keep on talking. And so, shall I just...
Please do, sir. Please do.
Before the time limit is over,
I
would like to hear something about two projects where, which is quite known to all of us. Actually, Cochin INTACH, Benny has come and given us a talk about the Musiris project. So, where he has restored a large number of historic buildings, keeping the integrity intact. And this Musiris project was done within the government framework. Similarly, he has undertaken another very challenging project in Alleppey, that is the Alleppey Heritage Project. In fact, I was reading quite a bit about the Alleppey Heritage Project the other day. So I would like to hear from Benny his experience in both these projects, especially when he worked within the governmental framework.
Yeah, so we work within the government framework. We had to go with the typical way of tendering the works, give the work to the lowest contractor, to the person who quotes, because in government, that's the only way we can work. And a lot of projects we have done, conservation and linked with this. We write the specifications. I'm not going too technical into it, but both these projects are for the future generations. We have done this project for the future generation in mind. For example, this is the Pallium Palace before restoration. This has been converted into a museum. And in this case, one of the big examples is that Pallium Palace is a private property. It is a trust property owned by a family members. So we have converted that into a museum. I mean, this is the before and after pictures. And in Musiris, we have done more than 50 buildings we have conserved. In Alleppey also, in the next 1 or 2 years, we'll be doing this, the Paravu synagogue before and after conservation. So government is the largest owner, or they own a lot of heritage properties. Our PWD engineers, Devasam Board engineers, doesn't know much about these buildings. So it is important that we make them aware of the advantages of conservation. When you don't know about it, you will say pull it down, but it will be a simple thing, simple crack or simple leakage. And these spaces can become very beautiful, can last much longer than many of these conventional concrete buildings, which could be done. This is Sahodar Ayyappan. Kerala, I can't see a thatched roof structure anymore. You have to really look for it. When I go across, travel from one part of Kerala to the other, you don't find that. But this is the house where the rationalist and former minister in the Cochin ministry, Sahodar Ayyappan's house. He was a reformer, social reformer, writer, writer and journalist and all those things. He used to run a magazine. So his house is made part of the Musiris project. We found alternate uses. For example, this is an old toilet before the picture. Now we have made it access. Next picture will show. You can see the toilet, which used as a urinal or the old way of having a WC before any of these European influence came. So all these things, we are losing it in a much faster way. So we are looking at a Musiris project, Alleppey project, targeting the school students. We were looking at the community being aware. The one thing which has happened in Fort Kochi was bringing in a legislation. Here we are not brought in the legislation at all, because legislation is not the answer to everything. We want the community to see conservation as from a development perspective. Conservation can lead. For example, this is a chapel in one of the historic areas. So this chapel, it was in a nice historical area. We just thought that we can't tell them to demolish it. Kerala, everything is a sensitive issue. So we have painted it with a light color and told them, can you change? Because this looks like an Asian Paints advertisement photograph in the brochure with all these colors. So we just tried to tell them. To our surprise, the church authorities came that they are willing to demolish this and bring it back to the old one. So this church which you see is what is existing. That the chapel which you saw in the last picture is no longer there. It is demolished, and a replica of the old chapel is sitting there, which is in a historic area. I mean, this is an old photograph. You can see now all the lights and restaurants and
this is Kottapuram.
Kottapuram. This is a Kottapuram, which is open. So this kind of awareness is coming from the public. We are we are trying to harness the support of the community, where the community is involved. And we don't want to bring in legislation. We don't want to impose anything to the people. We want to see people to see conservation in a positive way, trying to find alternative uses for these buildings. And according to my experience, I've been working in this for more than 30 years. If roof and the foundation is reasonably in good condition, we can prove that economically, finally everything boils down to economics. You can convince a house owner that it is cheaper to conserve the building if the roof and the foundation is reasonably in good condition. The rest of the thing. So it is, but you can have all the modern conveniences. The most expensive properties across the world are heritage buildings. If you want to go and stay in London, the apartments are the cheapest accommodation you can find. If you want to stay in a historic or heritage area, you have to pay through the nose. So this kind of thing, because we see historic buildings as a liability. We don't see it as an asset. I'm not saying the Western philosophy or Western concept should come, but we have to see our old buildings as an asset, and we have to see that our concrete buildings are not going to last forever. They will run into serious problems. And once you have a problem with a concrete building, it is very, very costly to repair a concrete roof if it develops leakage. That's why all over Kerala, you can find a metal sheet roof being put over on a concrete roof. Because it develops leakage, they put a roof on top of it. So this is very important. And in Alleppey also, we are conserving many of the industrial heritage. Old factory buildings are being converted into museums, which is a major step. First time in India, perhaps industrial. Bombay had so many textile mills which was closed down, but none of them could be converted or conserved. But in Alleppey, we are conserving old factory houses. But the canals are there. There are two major canals which run like arteries, and full filth and this thing, very dirty. We have as part of the project, we are cleaning up the canals. Our campaign slogan is, canals are not drains, canals are canals. So we are just cleaning up the canals, and we have to maintain the canals. So there is a lot of community awareness program. So there are historic buildings or old buildings along the canals, and we have cleaned up the canals. And I have a photograph of people, not only doing fishing in the canals, the people are swimming in the canals. These were like drains. And first time in India, in the heart of the city, drains has been converted into canals. So this is one area where the old manuscripts of Kesari Balakrishna Pillai, who was a famous journalist, critic and writer, we just been seeing it dumped in places. So we just went and took it as part of the Musiris Heritage Project. I went into one of the old tire factories, and in the British managers, which is kept locked, I found a book which has a lock. This is the account book which has a lock. The book has a lock. Now we put the account books in Almara and lock it. So such interesting things and many unique things which is lost. And these are the photographs from the Alleppey which we are putting up in one of the museums. We were able to come out with a lot of old photographs, films, etc. If you look at this is the photographs taken during the 1940s. Looks like a famine state or famine place. Next photograph will show. So you can see these photographs. Only after seeing these photographs, I could say that Kerala in 75 years ago, there were people like this. Now we see such things only in National Geographic and some BBC documentaries, etc. We see where the bonds and everything. There was a time in Kerala, which is not very far, where people had suffered through famine and poverty and all those things. There might be still other.
So these are all going to be part of various museums.
Various
all these materials.
We are in the process of setting up. It's not an easy thing. It's we're just working out. This is the yarn museum. Some of the very initial ideas. A lot of changes are going to happen to these exhibits the way it is being done. I mean, we have collected a lot of old photographs, old pictures.
This is an old factory, if I'm right.
This is an older factory. This is one of the oldest factories in Kerala. The first factory was started by Darak and Ismail, two foreigners of Irish origin. And this was one. This is not the oldest factory. But that building was demolished. But the same people had set up this factory. So we are just going into finding adaptive reuses, trying to tell that government has to set examples for the public. See, without that,
in this context, I apologize. I do apologize for butting in,
please.
So but to sort of compress it, this is a hugely inspirational project. In Muziris, you said that there are about 50 buildings, historic buildings that have been restored, and they've been turned into museums, and they're in turn part of the alternate education process. That is one of the most inspiring parts of that whole project, because it's part of education, interactive education. The scale of the project is massive, and I don't think anything of that sort has been attempted anywhere else in India. Now in Alleppey it is happening, and I believe there are plans of replicating something like this model in Ponnani. So now all of these happened within the government framework. The restoration has been done, maintaining the integrity of the building. All of these wonderful things that you otherwise would have thought would not happen in the government framework have happened. But at the same time, we see the PWD being very sort of shoddy with restoring historic buildings under its care and so on. So what has changed? What is the difference between this one silo where things have happened in a way that we all admire, but then in a much larger world of government buildings, it doesn't happen? And the government, as you said, is the largest owner of historic buildings. What is the learning from Muziris that the government could probably adopt into a wider practice?
See, conservation is very positive. Conservation is development oriented.
Right.
When a old building, the solution is not to pull down the building. The solution is to retain the building, convert it for alternate uses. Right. Because the kaya factories might not function from the heart of Alleppey town anymore, but other uses it can be put. You can convert some of the kaya factories into restaurants or offices and IT parks and hotels. I mean, we have seen many such examples across the world. So Kerala also, or in India also, we have to set examples. And I think the government has to set examples. Then the private thing will happen. Now there is a much greater demand. I mean, if you look at the Chairman Masjid, which is a private property trying to restore back. The chapel example, which I showed in Kottapuram market, is a public-private. There are private properties which they want to convert it into this thing. It is we can show it's quite economically feasible, but the biggest hurdle is our modern architects and engineers are not taught about any of these things. So we have to demystify certain things about conservation and our knowledge about traditional building materials, which will help them. And that is what is required to be done at this stage. Our temple authorities, or there were some boards in Kerala, they have to be made aware of these things. And they have to
I'd just like to bring up an example that the Thrissur chapter of INTACH, they are currently, Vinod, who's the convener there, he's pulling out his hairs over the Parinur temple palace. There's a palace, small palace next to the temple. Very old building, beautiful old building, small palace. But then the Cochin Devasam board is going to tender. I mean, they've tendered for it to be pulled down. So in those cases, the government, I feel there is no internal knowledge system that informs those decisions. Like, how do you take a decision on something that has to be pulled down, and where do you restore? So where do you bring in a change in the government? Is it through workshops and influential?
See,
tell me. Make a reference here. When I was in the ASI, every day I used to get at least 1 or 2 letters from the state government saying that, no, not some voluntary organizations, heritage activists, etc., that this old building is going to be demolished, that old building is going to be demolished. And at the central government level, there was nothing much we could do except write it back to the state governments. And in most cases, we found that the response from the state governments was very little. They will forward the letter to the collector to the tahsildar, and the matter ends there. I mean, hardly I remember a single case where the state government has taken an active interest. And it has come to a situation that people were forced to go to the courts ultimately to get some sort of a protection from pulling down heritage buildings. This is the actual fact, actually.
Yeah, I'm here. See, sir, so you see, when you look at some of these things, even in the West, where when we go, say, to London or Paris, we saw heritage conservation happening. There also in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, things were not smooth. So many people, in Europe also, the affinity towards conservation heritage buildings happened when they were lost substantially. As a reaction to the loss or as a reaction to many of the modern buildings which came up. And many of the modern buildings which came up were, people did not like it. People hated it. I mean, many of the architects might not agree with that. That is exactly what is happening now also. The so-called multi-storied and concrete buildings which are coming up in our cities, the public hates the buildings. We have to realize that fact. That is why people say concrete disfigurement, matchbox-like structures. There is no life in those buildings. So, I mean, there's not a talk on those topics, but it was very right on the part of the, I will say I worked with the 3 governments. I mean, the project was started when Dr. Thomas Isaac was the finance minister, and he hails from the Muziris area. He was a renowned economist and scholar. So it was his concept that he did it. But even in the UDF government, when the Congress, there was a slight slowness in the progress, but they also supported it. So it's very, very important that these things have to be part, and it can bring in a lot of revenue. A lot of studies have been done. It can bring in tourism. People don't want to go to the modern cities. People want to go to historic places. So there is a revenue which can be generated, and it's economical, you can show it. But awareness is something which is lacking. So we have to bring this into a major aspect of our curriculum about the engineers and architects. We have to teach them about the traditional building materials, which is not happening now. We have to make them more practically experienced in trying to deal with it. Just learning alone won't help how to deal with the building. You need a practical exposure. That is not only part of the architecture or engineering, it is there with everything. You have a degree, but you don't know how to handle things until you learn it in the practical field. So awareness, our curriculum might have to be changed. We can bring out more publications, share this experience. See, 30 years ago or 35 years ago, before INTACH came into being, nobody used to talk about conserving an old building except the ASI. ASI conserved only 5,000 buildings out of the, it might have gone up slightly now, out of the so many historic buildings that we have. So just imagine. So INTACH, I think, has done a lot, but there is much more to be done.
So one is education is one point you're making, which is a critical part. Wider awareness, lawmaking, then enlightened influencers like Dr. Thomas Isaac. And also you're saying that it's a journey. And
we can't have Thomas Isaacs everywhere. So that you just leave it. We have to have an awareness among the politicians, bureaucrats, engineers, architects, and we should have the technical know-how also how to do it. So if tomorrow the Kerala government decides all our heritage buildings will be conserved, it will not be demolished, we don't have the expertise.
Hmm. Hmm.
which is true. I mean, in India, we don't have the expertise to conserve. Of course, ASI has the expertise, one of the best in the world, but they can't do beyond their monuments. So this is where INTAC and various organizations has to play a part. I think within the next 10 years or 15 years, there is much more awareness on heritage and conservation. And the new generation, I'm very hopeful that the new generation will pick up this knowledge and try to conserve our heritage. Because we have to bring in more publications. All those things are required. There is no need. That is why I said there is no need. I have gone through everything through a tough process. I don't want to do. We would like to publish many of the things. We already publish many of the things into small manuals and books, etc. So, which we would like to bring it down, bring out a little bit more.
No, the work that people like you do are very inspiring. They provide examples that these things are possible and they're not romantic notions. So we're very grateful for all that you do in terms of the actual projects and the publishing that you do. They do provide a proof of concept, as it were, for this journey ahead. I remember Mr. Babu Rajeev he was very passionate about a question which is linked to the recent events in Idiki in the wake of the landslide and all of that. So I think that's more or less the last question that we have.
We have a large number of people waiting to sort of interact.
Yeah.
So maybe
we can skip that question, Arun, if the time is limited.
I thought give them an opportunity to interact.
If they want to ask any questions, because that's it will take another.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's take some questions now. So one of the earliest questions, it's a tactical question, so maybe a quick answer. Mr. Mugundanunni asks, as a layman, my question is that the decay of all old houses typically start with termites. How do we prevent this?
Yeah, you see, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer in a webinar. One thing is that there are different types of termites. There are 2,000 varieties of termites. There are ground termites, which means it has a nest in the ground. There are flying termites. Some people, I think Mugundanulli is from Kerala. We say venchadal, that is a flying variety. Manchadal, which is the ground earth, white ants we call it in English, that is a ground termite. The drywood termites is the venchadal, that is a flying variety. So treating the ground will not be the solution. One of the major problems is that once the attack comes, if you apply any of the treatments which are available, any of the chemicals, they are all poisonous chemicals, not very, there are chemicals which are comparatively safer, but all these chemicals you apply, then if you apply it very carefully, then the termites can be killed. But one easy way of trying to do, for example, what we do, I'll just try to explain. You can send an email, I'll try to send an answer. We put an aluminum sheet under the timber wall plate. The termites cannot go from inside. So aluminum sheet to go, it's a very thin and it overlaps a little bit into the wall. And so if when we repair a building, we make sure that we put this aluminum sheet below the roof, below the timber. So the roof termites normally will not attack. The ground termites will not attack. But if the flying variety comes, which is not very common, then we have to apply the treatment. So when you repair a building, the treatment, when you apply, is not very expensive. 1,000 square feet building, it will be costing 3 or 4 rupees a square foot to treat the roof. It is not an expensive treatment, but you have to apply it very carefully and then do it. So our building has a Dakshina Chitra where we have transplanted timber buildings. We have not given any preservative treatment, but we are watching out on the building. So when the attack comes, we will deal with it.
Right.
So instead of applying chemicals everywhere and make it the whole poisonous, this thing. So it depends on case to case. With the modern know-how, but you have to know how the termites attack, which variety of termite is attacking, you can take care of it. It's not easy to answer through a webinar.
No,
if you have a particular case, send a photograph.
Most free to, we can connect you to Benny, and you can take the conversation, you can mature it further directly. But there are techniques, is what I'm hearing. The next question is from Rashmi. It's a great question. I would like to ask a question. What role does restoration, recycling, and reuse of buildings have in the present environmental scenario of Kerala, in which rapid remedial construction of properties are to be done due to the floods? What role does conservation play in this?
So the way you deal with floods is completely different. I'm not going much into it, this. But see, when you are reuse materials or recycle building materials, you are making lesser impact on the environment.
Right.
Because already those materials are made an impact on the environment. So when you recycle the whole building, that is the most sustainable way of, the best example of sustainable architecture or green building, because you are recycling the whole building. When you recycle parts of buildings or when you reuse parts of buildings, it's environmentally very sound. I mean, it's sustainable. I mean, when you make a new building with concrete and bricks and quarried stone, it makes much more impact on the environment. So reuse, my advice will be try to reuse, try to recycle, and try to use a technology which we can. I do a lot of timber buildings. If you go to my website, many of my projects, a lot of timber buildings I do. I've been doing timber buildings for the last 30 years. I use extensive use of timber in Mammootty's house. This is one of the variation I made from Laurie Baker. Laurie Baker was reducing the use of timber, but I thought timber is very sustainable and it can be reused, it can be recycled. So I wanted to limit the use of concrete. So many of my buildings, only the ground floor is concrete. First floor is made with timber if the client is willing to do. Otherwise, we limit the use of concrete if you look at most of the projects which I do. So it's always better to recycle and reuse. But when it comes to disasters and floods, there are certain other criteria which comes into play. And instead of elaborating, Arun wanted to ask that question. I got prepared for it, but what I will suggest will be my website. I have written a book on flood, how to mitigate floods, or how to repair buildings which has been affected by floods. So it is that book is there in my website. So you can download that book and read. It's a simple book. You can just finish reading in although 182 pages or 162 pages. I am trying to explain how floods happen, how to take care of various aspects of floods, because I have experience of working in 2-3 disasters. I worked in Latur earthquake, one village I did, Gujarat earthquake I did, tsunami I did, more than 1,500 houses. So based on that experience, I wrote, when 2018 floods came, I wrote, that you have to plan for floods. You can't just rebuild a house when a flood comes on it. I mentioned all these things in detail, and don't think that the floods will come only. In 2018 itself, I've written very clearly, floods are going to be a very frequent occurrence in Kerala. And 2019 we had floods. 2020 we have a taste of flood. We don't know whether floods will come again. This thing, because the global warming is a reality. Climate change is happening. We cannot become an amphibian, or we cannot do the Noah's Ark or anything. None of those things are possible. We have to live with this reality. So I just given certain examples. I'm not trying to explain it.
So just to add to that, Shibin asked a question related to exactly that. So his question is it advisable in this environment where we anticipate more of these extreme weather events? Is it advisable to use what he calls vernacular materials? I think he means local materials. He says vernacular. Is it advisable to use them? My assumption would be that there is he implies that the materials we have used in vernacular buildings are weaker and less resilient. Is that true?
No, that is not true. See, even when the Ahmedabad earthquake came, I mean the Gujarat earthquake, it was the multi-storied buildings which collapsed more than the traditional Kachi houses survived it.
Right.
I mean, it's a very well-known fact. You look at any of the literature which is there. It is the concrete buildings which was done, which has collapsed. So there are so many studies, so many cases. What is more important is the quality of construction, how well you have constructed the building. And when it comes to flood, elevation becomes very important. If you go and build a concrete building in a floodplain, it will also get affected. Elevation becomes important. I try to explain all these principles in my book. It is Malayalam copy is also there, English is also there. So you can just try. So I've said how to overcome it, because you can't demolish all the buildings which were affected by floods in 2018. There are 5,000 square feet house, 3,000 square feet house, and no flood has come during the last 50 years or 80 years in those places like Chengannur, Ramni, and those areas. So it is not practical to say that those buildings are unfit for living. You have to demolish or you have to abandon those buildings. Impossible to say. So we have to make those buildings sustainable for a future flood of at least the same intensity, which can be done. So there are certain standards which people use during flood, the disaster dust-and houses. But unfortunately, in most of the disasters, we don't take any measures. Once the flood is gone, we forget about the flood. We just try to build another house in the same place, which is not going to solve the problem. And I think the problem is going to become serious over the next few years.
So another question, and I'd like both of you to answer this because it's also in a sense an ASI question. Mr. Hormis Tarakan. So his question is, should not protected monuments in Kerala state have a no building zone, a buffer zone around it, so as to retain the integrity of these monuments? The Central Act has a buffer of 100 meters where no building is allowed. Should there be a similar buffer zone in Kerala? So maybe Benny, and after that, Mr. Babu Rajeev, both of you could.
See, there are very few buildings which are protected legally. For example, in Mussiris, which is a very historic area, which is 150 square kilometers, there is only one centrally ASI protected monument. The oldest mosque is there, and there are 3 synagogues in that area, which is very old. And some of the oldest temples in Kerala are there. But in spite of that, there are only 7 state protected monuments. Government has a lot of limitations although there can be a demand that every building should be protected, might not be possible for the government to legally protect all the buildings because the numbers are huge. Our heritage is huge. In Mussiris itself, in our first survey, we found that there are more than 500 heritage buildings in that area. In Alleppey, definitely it will be even more than 500 if you just take the smaller buildings also into account. Legal protection, when you don't have a mechanism to enforce the legal framework, there is no point in trying to do. For example, we have a CRZ, we found that 20,000 violations are there. When we have this thing, you apply to the National Monuments Authority, they give. Hardly we hear about many rejections, we don't hear. So this kind of enforcing the mechanism, we don't have. So my solution, legislation might not be the correct solution. The best solution will be to conserve, make the public aware. Unless the public is proud of their heritage and aware, our buildings are not going to be protected in a big way.
Sir, would you like to comment on that? Because the ASI usually does not become very much loved for that buffer zone provision.
I would come specifically to the question asked. Specifically asking about the buffer zone.
Buffer zone, yeah.
Yeah, because what happened is a large number of protected buildings, which are beautiful, fine buildings. People have come and put double-story building, triple-story buildings right in front of it, completely spoiling its visible integrity. In that context, only a rule was brought in the ASI that first 100 meters, should be a no-build zone. And another 200 meters should be a restricted area where people can construct only with prior permission. Now, this has plus and minus points. The plus point was that a large number of buildings were protected from this sort of an encroachment, visible encroachment. The bad part was that in cities like Delhi or Bombay and all, a huge area near a protected monument becomes completely, nobody can build anything. This has created a real problem between with the ASI and the public, and we used to get flooding of letters about construction. Even repairs were not allowed. I think the best way is we must have a buffer zone. Every protected building must have a buffer zone. Otherwise, you will start building next to it and 3-story, 4-story buildings, and the whole thing will be completely covered by built spaces. But it should be specific to each monument. See, what is relevant for Taj Mahal will not be relevant to a small little structure somewhere in the backyard, far away in a village area. So, government has made some relaxation to this. And I think an exercise is underway for each monument, for each protected building, to define what should be the buffer area, the restricted and protected area. I think this is a very nice thing to do, but you must have some sort of a buffer area between a protected structure and any other construction.
So is there, in a state like Kerala, where the density of population built density, all of that is very great, is that, do you think that is...
So that we need not keep the 100 meters and 200 meters. You can confine to, depending on the size of the protected building, you can restrict it to 25 meters, 50 meters.
Right.
I mean, it should differ from case to case.
I think so, Arun. I also agree with that point. It should be discussed on a case-to-case point instead of just having a 100 meters or 500 meters zone.
A lot of people who are not exactly asking a question, but there's a lot of admiration for your work, especially at Muziris. A number of people have written that. And I would like to add my own and our group's admiration. We admire that project hugely. I think I'll take one last question, which is from Malini. So her question is, along with buildings, is there a traditional mode of handling the landscape that can be revived in Kerala that you advocate or practice? Conservation of landscapes.
Yeah, you see, I mean, some of the cases which we have come across is connected with the sacred groves. Most of the sacred groves in the southern part of Kerala have disappeared, or the area has come down. There are some which have survived in this, but in North Kerala, this is still there. There are sacred groves are very common, still conserved as part of the various traditions they have. I mean, what I would like to tell is that conservation of landscape, definitely it is possible, but we have to look at the kind of species which we are growing. I think whether it's, if the coastal area, the landscape is of a very different nature. 10 kilometers, you move towards the east, the landscape changes completely. Another 20 kilometers go, the landscape becomes that of very similar to that in Western Ghats. So there is a huge variation in terms of the landscapes. And when we do the filling up, there are a lot of traditional, intangible heritage connected with the landscape which is disappearing. For example, one of the classic cases which we are trying to do, do it in Muziris, there is a particular way of cultivation in the Muziris area. I mean, it's not only Pokali Krishi, where there is a particular variety of paddy which floats in water. So when the water, which is very, very way, and this is disappearing. Mangroves, for example, there are a lot of native species, native trees, native fish varieties, which is disappearing. So, so all these things, I think we should try to take the built environment, just like we advocate for the built environment, we should look at the natural environment also in a serious manner, trying to conserve many of the tree species. When I was a child, we could see so many species, but rubber has become like an invasive species along the central Travancore, has displaced many of the trees which has come. There are still, but you can still see many of the trees in the house compounds. So each of the landscape, it is quite different, which you are trying to do. So in Alleppey, for example, if you try to look at the urban landscape, we have found that the canals is very important, but the role of the canal has undergone changes. In the olden days, it was used to bring the kaya products or transport the kaya products from the factories. But now it has undergone changes because most of the kaya factories are not working. But we can definitely look at using it both in Mussiris and Alleppey. We are not, Alleppey, the houseboats are there in the backwaters, but we are not advocating for houseboats into any of these canals. We don't want that because the benefits and should go to the local community. Houseboats are mostly owned by people sitting. I mean, there are locally owned houseboats as well, but there are many houseboats which are owned by people sitting in Kochi and Madras and Goa and Delhi. So, and all these bigger, small is beautiful, which Schumacher advocated, I think is quite applicable to many of these things. I'm not advocating it in a big way, but we have to see it as a case to case. It is very, very important to conserve the natural environment or the natural landscape also. We have seen it in all of our projects. We try to restore that. There are very natural way of doing things. It's mostly intangible heritage, which it is. And I think
just related to that, one of the other areas where I've known you to work is in the restoration of public spaces, which, I mean, we had these beautiful junctions and corners and all of these things, which had great character. And you have done some work also in restoring the quality of public spaces. Do you want to spend maybe a minute talking about that?
See, well, I'll just briefly, because the time is running out, I'll just slightly briefly explain. For example, in Kottapuram market, we have done 3 public marketplaces. All these markets were by the side of the waterfront, either the river or one of the canals, because earlier it was the water was the main means of transport. Now buses and lorries have taken over. So, but there's I mean, again, you see this market, the photographs is again intangible heritage. In another 10 years, these things will disappear. I mean, I had a US architect working with me. She came to this market and saw jute, chili and everything in jute bags. She has seen all these chili powder in plastic sachets. And she took this photograph. She said, and she was showing this photograph, see this, see this, see this. For us, we never see about these things. As a child, we used to see these things in our villages where we grew up. So, I mean, so this is part of the intangible heritage. We need development. Things have to undergo changes. But see these buildings as an asset. It will have to undergo some changes. Create nice public design spaces, which is very, very important. This is something which we don't give any importance in India. Public space design. In Mussiris and Alleppey, we are doing it. Now the government has just, I think the work has been awarded to a contractor. We are just trying to do I mean, this is how a building on the left-hand side, how it looked. See, when we did this Mussiris Kottapuram market, for example, only 6 shop owners came forward to do the work. But finally, when the work was done, out of the 300, we were able to create a character for about 200 buildings. I mean, it's still an ongoing process by which the buildings are done in trying to keep the heritage character. So this is an amphitheater we have created by the waterfront, and people have taken over those spaces. We need to create places for the public, people, etc. So we find when we did this market, which is in a rural area, more than 1,000. Now, as part of the Musiris project, the Musiris company has given Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi to that. We have more than 1,000 people accessing the waterfront in a day. I think the number would have gone up. So when I say 1,000 people, it is more than a year before. We have pedestrianized some of the areas. We have put some eating places. We are not allowing public. You can see the bollards in this, and people can enjoy the waterfront. So people come from far off places to enjoy the waterfront. Similarly, in Alleppey also, we are trying to get the public spaces also done. So the idea is to develop the public spaces, which is very much important. You have to bring the design of the public spaces. You have to bring the design, conservation of intangible heritage consciously into your master plan. Just conserving buildings, you are not going to gain much. We have to see it as a developmental project, to see it as a developmental plan. The support we have got in Musiris is because we saw it as a developmental project. After the Musiris, now Alleppey, Talasheri, Ponnani, Kollam, Travancore Heritage, so many projects are being done by the government. I'm doing only 2. There are so many other projects which have been launched by the government, which shows that the Musiris project was a successful model. Looking at that. So I hope, I would like to think that we are in the 50s and 60s of the European cities, of the European thing. The awareness on heritage is growing.
At least that's a fantastic, very hopeful place to sort of draw our conversation to a close. This is massively inspirational. Thank you so much. As I said, as I always say in these sessions with wonderful people like you, there will always be a lot that will be unsatisfied at the end of these sessions, because you open up so many interesting possibilities about which we'd like to know more. But then in this session, even with our sort of slightly casual approach to time, there's only so much we can stretch it. So thank you so much. This was wonderful, and thank you everybody who both of you, especially you very senior practitioners, for spending time with us. You're part of the INTACH family. We're very grateful for your time. There are many more sessions coming. Not just from us, there are other chapters of TAC doing similar sessions on related disciplines. For example, the Architecture Heritage Division has a wonderful session coming up just tomorrow, where Professor Kulbhushan Jain will be presenting on Rajasthani architecture. So these sessions are there. I think the same week, the Madras chapter has 2 excellent sessions coming up. One on the temples of Madras by Dr. Chitra Madhavan, which is a wonderful presenter, and on the heritage of the Buckingham Canal. So there are many of these sessions coming, so stay tuned. We have more sessions coming towards the end of this month. Thank you very much, Benny. Thank you very much, Mr. Babu Rajeev. This was just a wonderful session to be on. We learned so much. And everybody who tuned in, we could not ask all the questions, but feel free to type in your questions on our Facebook page, and we will make sure that Benny sees them and we'll get back with a response. But for now, good night and have a great week ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arun.
Thank you, Benny. Let me also personally thank you again. It was a wonderful session, very informative. You have really given us a new understanding of restoration, recycle, and reuse. And coming to your Alleppey project, as I was telling you, I was reading quite a lot about it after hearing about it. Cochin also maybe very soon having a lot of work on the canal restoration. At the moment, I don't know what is the status of the project, but other day we had a session with the former Chief Secretary where he mentioned that he is being appointed as the State and Navigation Canal and Navigation Chairman. So they are taking up, Tom Jones, who was the Chief Secretary, is now posted as the Chairman of this corporation. And he said a very major project, which is designed by the Dutch and the local state government, is going to be implemented in Cochin.
Okay.
Let me really hope that this will also be something like your Alleppey.
Yeah, True. And it's that whole thing of a virtuous cycle. You create one example and it radiates outwards and creates new examples, good examples. And to all the young people who are watching this, as soon as you can travel, please go to Muziris, travel to all these sites. Your participation makes these projects sustainable. Also, you learn so much. We have done tours to that area. But as soon as you can travel, please go to these places. They're really, we always blame the government for things that are not working, but here is a project where it has worked at so many levels. So please do try to go to those places and support these initiatives. Once again,
thank you so much. You had been the moving spirit behind this, though of course we together work for this.
Thank you so much. It's our pleasure. Our pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye.
Good night. Good night.
Good night.